here's something that I say almost always when I talk to workers, just to give them this language. I'm not totally anti-psychiatry. I'm not totally anti-drugs. I'm against psychological diagnosis that invisibilizes the political context. And I'm against the overuse of drug to manage people's anger, rage, outrage, and responses, right? If it was depression, I could look at your behavior and look at the criteria that you meet the criteria for depression, and we get you on antidepressants, and within 3 months, the symptoms would go down. But I'm guessing that's not what happened. If it was anxiety, a lot of the other word people saying is the workers are anxious. They have anxiety about going to work. If it was anxiety, again, we could diagnose you, look at the behaviors and say, oh, this meets the diagnostic criteria for anxiety, get you anti-anxiety medicine. Again, within a couple of months, it should go down. The reality is those things won't work because it's not depression, it's oppression. And it's not anxiety, it's dread. Our work is full of dread right now. So work, like I said, those workers that I just remember that one session I had with housing workers who in the early days of this catastrophe had 18 overdoses, the first like 18 overdoses on a shift. And they all, didn't want to go to work the next day. They were afraid to go to work every day. That's not anxiety. I was brought, managers were saying to me, the team has anxiety. I'm like, this is not anxiety. It's dread. And the work is full of dread because they are going to face people dying in front of them again, whether they're able to bring them back to life or not. That's not a mental problem of the worker. That is a political problem in our environment where we're leaving people to death, right? So I think these psychological terms of depression, anxiety, trauma, vicarious trauma, they obscure much more than they reveal. And they're not language, Janella Bird talks about talk that sings. When someone names it for you, and usually when I'm with workers and I say something about it's not depression, it's oppression, people are like, yes. And it's not anxiety, it's dread because the work is full of dread. It's like that names what it is. We need to use words to actually explain what's happening, not to diagnose people so there's a treatment so we get them better to throw them back to hell without changing any of the context of the necropolitics, right? My goal at the end of my career is not to not be burned out. It's to have sustainability. And sustainability is something very different than not burning out, right? Sustainability is about having an ongoing aliveness, a genuine connectedness with people, and a willingness to bring your spirited self to people again and again. That's sustainability, to be useful in your life across your whole lifespan in your paid and unpaid work. If we look at measures, like if you go on, on the tube, you can find a test about whether or not you have vicarious trauma or whether or not you have burnout. Sometimes when I'm going into teams, management or organizations will say, we want to test them for vicarious trauma before you come, and then we'll have you here, and then we're going to test them and see if you made a difference. And I'm like, no, not doing that. I'll tell you why. Those tests don't measure vicarious trauma and burnout. They measure privilege. If you grew up safe, your family not having to leave residences, not losing your housing, having both parents be able to be there and have paid work and have food security and just shit like that, you're going to look like a much more professional person than someone who came from a life of struggle and disadvantage and harm and oppression, right? Someone who's had a life of struggle. What those tests measure, they ask questions like, do you think about your clients between sessions? Well, people who are working at overdose prevention sites are their clients. Right. So it makes people with lived and living experience look like they're less professional than very rich professionals who live somewhere in the leafy suburbs, go into the downtown east side and help these poor folks and then leave afterwards. They don't have drug users showing up on their lesbian baseball team, so they look like they've got better boundaries. Right. Again, people with lived and living experience always being accused of being worse professionals, having bad boundaries, when in fact, we hire them and bring them into this work because they have cultural knowings, they have wisdom, because they belong in community. And then we accuse them of being bad professionals because they belong in their communities, right? The queer and trans folks, this is not anything new. but it's also true for immigrants and refugees, right? You can't be, you can't work as a translator for someone in your community because you might have bad boundaries. Well, you speak Arabic, who are you supposed to translate for, right? So just thinking about that, we're navigating multiple relationships, not dual relationships. But, you know, when people have repeated losses, and I understand there are times people want to take space from work, but after tragedy, in particular, deaths by violence and other things like that, the worst thing to do is send the whole team to go out to their own families with each other, where you're talking to people who know nothing about your work. And the only thing your beloveds can say to you is, Seth, we're going to save you from this shit. We're going to get you a job at the family car shop, and we can live on one salary. They're going to try to rescue you, right? Whereas solidarity is, that's when teams need to most be together in solidarity, in a shared struggle, right? Like with revolutionary love, what Paulo Freire talks about as revolutionary love, a commitment to others and a connection with their cause, right? We need to actually move in with each other after these kinds of tragedies, not everybody taking a couple of days off together, right? Yeah, I'm not saying people shouldn't have time, but I'm just saying immediately you want to make sense of it with the people who make sense.
And I think that also has us looking at some of the practices that are just embedded in the way organizations react to how grief moves through community, and saying, okay, something happened, we'll give you a taxi chit and send you home. You're sending someone home all by themselves. You're not asking if there's someone at home to greet them, how they're getting their meals prepared, even if they're going to have someone to help them, remind them to bathe and do those things, because grief takes you over in so many different ways.
Yeah.
So I even reflect on like things that just didn't really feel right to me, but I just moved and said, okay, this is what I have to do. I have to go isolate myself. I have to do this. I wanted to be with community, right? So how could we, and I think about lived and living experience really connecting to how could we inform like community, people who build programs, people we work with around what works best for us, and actually have the ability to see it through so it's implemented and practiced in a way that others can have access to. Because I think we have these thoughts that we put out, but how could we really turn that into what works and have that transcend into how our friends and our colleagues are being taken care of? Because I think there's so much, like I hold a lot of personal responsibility as someone that brings my lived experience into this work. Like, how can we empower each other to really bring those voices to the forefront? How can we empower each other to know that we have a space at these tables for these discussions? Because I feel like while our lived experience is an asset and we step forward, there are certain instances where we do take a step back, where it is looked at as something where you're not as professional, or you're not as clean cut, or you're not as polished. Like, no, I have what it takes and I have the skills and I'm coming with this knowledge. Like, how do we really empower ourselves to bring that knowledge into spaces?
You know what? I am out of scope to answer that question. You know, I am someone who has a PhD from university. I don't come to this whole, to this with lived experience in terms of being a drug user and stuff. And I think about, you know, I get listened to so much more now that I have a PhD, and I'm saying exactly what I said 30 years ago before I had one, which is my work is bringing everything we know about sustainability and solidarity work from social movements and bringing that into the stuff that's called community work. So I mean, what I would say is, like all social justice oriented work, you take oppression on all fronts. And Cassandra, you're at a table now and you fought for that space, and we got to back you up and shoulder you up to be in there and make sure that you're listened to, right? I think you have to take it on kind of on all fronts. What I would say is I think that we've got to take a less psychological approach to this and a more solidarity approach. So I talk about my work as a supervision of solidarity, not just for the client, but also for the worker, but also for me. And when I talk about solidarity, I'm never talking about unity. Solidarity is not about agreeing on things. It's about sharing ethics, having collective ethics. How we do it is very different, but we have these points of connection, and we share and shoulder each other up in struggle, and we make connections across struggles, right? So one of the things that I invite teams to do, or individual workers to do, is to build a solidarity team. That you got to have a team around you. And I also don't think it should be your work team, Because when the shit hits the fan and tragedy strikes and you lose a person at the overdose prevention site, everyone's heart is on the ground. So we need to call in, who are the people who can actually help you do this work? Who shoulders you up? Who keeps you alive? Who witnesses you, right? And the reality is everybody's got to build this team, not just of your coworkers. We are doing the heavy lifting, and we are in the water, and we're drowning, and we're treading water. And I can tell you as a lifeguard, the person in the water with you is going to take you down. You're both going to drown. There are people in the boats. Those are people with more privilege, people with further distance from this work. Every worker has some people in their life who say, oh my God, Cassandra, I've got so much respect for you. I could never do what you do. There's all kinds of people who can't do what we do, but you know what they can do? They can be on your solidarity team, and you can call them, and the answer's not, you're not telling them what happened. You're telling them what you need. Like, I've got a friend who's been a flute player in the orchestra, who, when I call, they'll come over, make me dinner, make me eat it, take my body for a walk. They'd clean my bathroom and they'd rub my feet. That's a really good thing. And we don't talk about what happened. We talk about what I need, and I get reconnected. Trauma disconnects intellectually, spiritually, in your physical body, your relationship to others, your relationship to Mother Earth. What we need in solidarity is connection and belonging, so that someone is committed to you. Someone on your solidarity team comes when you call, and they don't abandon you. They refuse to abandon you, and they stay with you until you are reconnected to your own intellect, your own spirituality, your physical body, your relationship with them, your relationship to Mother Earth, right? People need to build a solidarity team, and they have to have somebody that I call a howl at the moon person. I'll tell you what that means. There are times in this work that you are going to be what I call batshit crazy. When you're not going to make sense, you're going to almost sound suicidal to other people. If people didn't do our work, you could say enough things that if somebody got a suicide checklist off the internet, they'd be like, oh shit, Seth's going to offer themselves. Look what they said. Their things are dark. I can't do this anymore. They haven't slept for 3 nights. Oh my God, they've got enough criteria. I got to call the police on them. We're going to do a mental wellness check. Remind yourself, right? In a 3-month period in Canada a couple of years ago, 6 people of color were shot dead by Canadian police on mental wellness checks, right? It's no help to me. There's no solidarity for me in you calling the police or a social worker to do a mental wellness check. There's nothing would hurt my mental wellness more than a man in a uniform with a gun coming to my door. I promise you. It also shows we don't have solidarity. You don't get me. So you need to have someone who's your howl at the moon person. The first thing they need to know is, I am not going to kill myself. If I was going to kill myself, I wouldn't implicate you like this. I'm calling you because I need you to help me get reconnected. So here's somebody you have a pre-existing relationship of respect and dignity, and they get you. And so what I'm looking for, if I call you, Seth, and I'm like, I got to howl at the moon, I am looking for you to create an ethical container where I can get reconnected back to myself. And you're not going to abandon me until I get there. And we need to have agreements. You have to have a solidarity team first. You have to have a howl at the moon person before you need it. If you can anticipate that you're going to lose your shit doing this work, and I promise you, everybody loses their shit doing this work. Anything that you can plan on, it's not a catastrophe. Like it's not an emergency if you could have actually predicted it, right? So what we need to do is create a relationship with somebody who's your howl at the moon person before you need it. Because remember, trauma disconnects, and we are our least creative when we're experiencing the stuff that gets called trauma. So you need to have somebody you're going to already call, and we have these agreements. I don't want a mental health check. I don't want to be pathologized, right? Seth, I don't want someone to tell me, sounds like you should talk to your doctor. This sounds like depression. This sounds like anxiety. I don't want that. And I don't want to be rescued. I don't want someone to say, look, Vikki, you're in your 60s now. You've done yours, girl. Kick back, go back to the university, write a paper, write another book. I don't want to get rescued from the work. What am I looking for is that ethical container and a reconnection, right? So I think one of the things we need to do is have workers build a solidarity team and have a howl at the moon person. And I think everybody's kind of got to have that in place before you need it. I think that that's really important. but I don't want to prioritize that over mutual aid. You know, so Dean Spade, critical trans theorist who wrote a book called Mutual Aid. Mutual aid has been going on always, as long as communities of struggle have been helping each other respond to what they need in this catastrophe and the next, like in perpetuity from all cultures, right? When I think about mutual aid, I think about collective care. Like, so for me, I've always talked about collective care as opposed to self-care, and thinking about what are the experiences we have, what are some of the things that we do with each other, how do we do mutual aid with each other that is meaningful? Cassandra, I guess that's my response to your question. I don't know how to get to the tables and make these folks listen to us. That's nothing I have any capacity for. It's probably why I still work with workers and I'm not like in management, you know, but I do think that we've got to find and promote, you know, ways of doing mutual aid with each other that keep us sane in situations that are outside of human understanding. It is outside of human understanding to me, the gaslighting that Canadians are okay with 17 people dying every day from a bad policy. Wow. I did, you know what? At the beginning of this catastrophe, I thought it would take 2 or 3 years, because I was seeing how different it was than the AIDS catastrophe, because we didn't know what AIDS was. We didn't have a cure. We had a cure for this before it happened, which is give us clean substance, right? So I think mutual aid is our sanity project. I think of any dialogues when we get together and we howl at the moon, or when we have solidarity teams, or when we connect on like any mutual aid stuff like that, I think about those as sanity making projects. I really do. That's the stuff that's going to keep us like alive and sustained in the work, is mutual aid, solidarity teams, howling at the moon, whatever, you know, whatever beautiful things people are doing. And I get to talk to tons of workers about what they're doing, and people are doing gorgeous things with each other. You know, they're reaching out in ways that matter. Cassandra, like you were saying, the help that helps, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I know it was a pretty loaded question, and I just appreciate your response. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. No, I think that's kind of the guts of what we were talking about last time, right? But I don't have any great prescriptions of what people should do for collective care or for mutual aid projects, but I think they have to be organic. There has to be space for them, right? There has to be time for them. But yeah, there's nothing, there's no project in particular. It's organic and it's emergent. And yeah, I'm just really curious about what everybody that you're involving in this project and everyone they're talking to. I'm always curious about, like, what are people already doing? Because people are doing gorgeous things to keep each other alive, to honor their dead, to fight like hell for the living, right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Vikki. Always inspiring. And, you know, I think about the most important and meaningful mutual aid projects that I've seen in action are unsanctioned sites, are places where people can come and use, and they can be taken care of, and they can get access to meeting their basic needs, and they can have a communal place to get together where they're not going to be stigmatized, where they're not going to be kicked out by a certain time, where they can use in ways that are preferred community practices, that are trauma informed, that come from the ways that people have used drugs and continue to use drugs, cultural practices of care. So really, really important conversation, and I just appreciate your time so much.
Well, and that goes back to the Dr. Peter Center. You know, we all think Insight was the first supervised injection site, but we know that's not true, right? The Dr. Peter Center was always helping people do that, as were 1,000 other places though, right? Like there's all these sites while it was criminalized and stuff. I just keep thinking about the amazing direct action activism that is harm reduction, how all communities of struggle have always worked to care for each other. And in drug using communities, how people, you know, I just think about the nurses who stole needles before you were allowed to give people clean needles and got written up for that. And hospitals and administrators tried to have them lose their licensure as nurses for doing this. And then 15 years in the future, Vancouver wants to go to the International Harm Reduction Conferences, tell them how we invented all this shit. You know, it's always on the back of beautiful humans doing mutual aid, seeing what's required, what we need to do to stay alive together and doing that for each other, right? And so, you know, a lot of these histories cannot be spoken, right? A lot of this history of resistance cannot be spoken because it was breaking all these rules. Like, yeah, and it would endanger folks, but just get really curious about how everybody has stayed alive in this work, because mutual aid's always been around. Solidarity is the thing we've always had, right? Yeah, so yeah. So I just really appreciate this invitation, and I'm very excited about the kind of dialogues that are gonna like be emergent, like responding to these kind of things, but also more importantly, the actions people are taking collectively, collaboratively, interwovenly, right? We keep us safe. Yeah. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Vikki.
Okay. Bye now.